let's look at these stories in a bit more detail. Joining me to do that is political commentator and communications officer at the Institute of Economic Affairs, Harry Griffiths. Harrison, good morning.
Morning, Rosie. How are you?
I'm really well. Who will be feeling extremely frustrated this morning is parents who are in the dark about how safe their children's school is, or they've been told the school is shut. How do you think the government have handled this so far? Because we're hearing, and details on the front page of the Times, that the Chancellor says, look, we'll get it sorted, but we don't have that much clarity on how or how long this is going to take.
Absolutely. And forgetting even, the government's immediate response, which has not been very convincing. One question that I certainly have, and I'm sure parents up and down the country have, is why now? Why over the last few weeks? Just as we're getting ready for kids to start going back to school, have we figured out that there are scores of schools and possibly far more across the country which aren't safe in terms of pure structure? The timing of it is very alarming, and it's difficult to understand why only now we are beginning to realise this.
And what we're learning from, front page of The Guardian is saying there's no extra cash for the repairs. You've got to find the money elsewhere. I think we've got to understand that they can't just expand how much money they've got in that budget. But is that the right strategy to say, well, it's going to come from our existing pots that we've put aside?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's something that is pretty inescapable at the moment, that there isn't a lot of money going around, and the government knows it can't continue to just borrow money as it has previously. But, if I were in the Department of Education or Treasurer in any other department right now, this would certainly be a high priority. The thing that I think, puts it all in perspective is that they're talking about 156 schools at the moment, which is not a chronic problem. But the bigger concern, I think, is that they just don't know how far this issue goes.
And quite a lot of questions as to why we don't know about that. The other concern, Gillian Keegan has said we will not return to the dark days of school lockdowns, because some schools that have been forced to close, there's about 104 of them at this point, they'll be reverting back to lockdown online learning because there isn't the classroom space.
Yeah, absolutely, and we've already seen the impacts on educational standards and progress of a whole generation of children who have missed out on years worth of schooling, and that's just from the COVID lockdowns. We're only beginning to understand, never mind to try and fix the impact of those missed years of schooling. And for however many children it ends up being, this is yet another setback, and that will worry parents as well. How urgently are they willing to deal with this at the start of a new school year, when so many of these children will have already missed out on crucial years of learning?
It looks likely that this is going to be sort of the big political challenge for the Prime Minister this week. But, also front page of the Times, and we mentioned it with Terry, that migrant crossings approaching 900 a day. And they've said that the Prime Ministers were described as feeling frustrated last week. The big problem, Harrison, is that it's very difficult to determine if numbers were lower so far this year, which looks like they are than the year before. Is this down to policies that are working, or the fact that literally simply the weather's been much worse this summer?
It's probably a combination of all of them, as well as the reduction in certain pull factors that are bringing migrants to the UK. But either way, I'm not convinced that any overarching strategy is really effective here. 900 a day is still an enormous number of people, and it's still not clear that when they arrive here, that they are either being treated properly and humanely in the way that we have a duty to in this country, nor is it clear that they are being treated in a way that is acceptable to the British citizens, who expect that the money that is spent housing them, for example, is spent wisely, and that the government has a strategy to try and at least bring order to the number of migrants crossing into the country. My personal view is that, migrants ought to be treated humanely, and we ought not to be turning away people who are in desperate need. But at the same time, the British people do have a right to expect that it's done in an orderly way, in a controlled way. And part of that problem is that, there's, like like for so many native citizens, there just doesn't seem to be room in this country to house people. And the reason why is because we have such a chronic shortage of housing in this country. We need to build as well as accept migrants, as we have a moral duty to do.
There is a sort of a glimpse of good news. Hundreds of caseworkers have been recruited, so says The Times, to help clear the backlog of asylum cases. And it's understood the number of legacy cases has been brought down from a waiting list of 92,000 to 55,000. So that is some progress. The challenge for the Prime Minister, Harrison, is, what does he have to do in the public side to be deemed a success? He's made a pitch to say, I'm going to stop the boats entirely.
Yeah, and I think that was an unrealistic pledge. And, even if you could deliver that pledge, the things that you would need to do it, I think, are unthinkable. It is good that waiting lists and backlogs are going down. That was one of the key problems, is that the efficiency with which the Home Office processed claims of asylum dropped significantly in the years over COVID. And it's good to see that that's starting to come down. But that is, even putting in place positive reforms on that front is a years-long process. It's not something you can deliver immediately, and probably can't deliver to put good statistics on leaflets for an election in about a year's time. And so I think the Prime Minister needs to be fully upfront and honest with the British people about what our obligations are, and crucially what the government is actually able to do, because government is not an omnipotent power. It can't just fix everything with the snap of a finger, no matter how significant the outcry over a particular issue is. And I think managing expectations is important as well. Just shouting "stop the boats" every time there's an alarming statistic about the number of migrants coming into the UK is not an actual policy solution.
Talking about the sort of policies that have been in place over the last, I'm led to believe, 13 years, 121 days when the Conservatives were in power. Philip Collins has written his comment piece in The Times saying the Tories are unloved. It is easy to see why. He says 13 years in power, there are achievements the party can be proud of, but they're overshadowed by economic failure. Do you think that is the biggest failure over the last 13 years?
Yeah, I would say it is. I mean, despite some somewhat positive news towards the end of last week that the ONS revised our GDP growth over the last 2 years upwards to now make us, I think, the second quickest growing G7 country since the pandemic. It's still fair to say growth has been truly sluggish. Our national debt has grown, as pointed out. The British government has run deficits in all but 1 year since the Conservative Party came to power, despite promises the deficit would be eliminated by 2015 during the coalition era. And it's not, it's not just that. There's an entire generation of people, of which I am one, where the prospect of home ownership looks more remote than ever. People at the top of the age pyramid who are, on pensions, who are already owners of property, are effectively being subsidised at the expense of the rest of the country, and there is no growth to back it. And so when you look back on 13 years, but beyond 13 years, it is difficult for people, particularly people in my generation, to say, yeah, I feel better off, or I feel as if the opportunities that young people can expect in a country like Britain have been available to me in the same way that maybe they have been to previous generations. Yeah.
You can read that comment piece as part of your Times subscription. Let's move on from politics, Harrison. And look, this story makes me so sad. It seems like a necessary evil. I'm looking at page 5 of the Times here. Tesco workers are being offered body cameras because the rise in physical assaults has risen by a third in a year. I mean, what a sad state of affairs when they're being said, well, if you feel like you'll be safer to wear one of these, we'll give you one.
Yeah, absolutely. And a necessary evil, I think, is absolutely the word. When you've got stories as we have in the last week, I think it was in the Daily Mail today, actually, that police are being told to investigate all instances of shoplifting, even if the value of the stolen goods is less than £200. They should be doing that type of stuff anyway. It's a damning indictment of where policing is on crimes like shoplifting. Burglaries as well, home burglaries, are very rarely actually fully investigated, never mind solved. And so it's easy to understand how people who are prone to shoplifting and assaulting shop workers feel that they can do so with impunity. And I am glad to see that there is an understanding, in private organisations that protections and safety of their staff needs to be beefed up, because those staff need to be empowered to deal with those who themselves have been empowered by a lack of law enforcement on these issues over the last few years. A collapse in law enforcement, really.
Yeah, that story makes the front page of the Telegraph too. Some slightly lighter news. Why don't we take a look at that? I have to say, as a teenager, I had a lesson repeatedly from my dad on how to avoid an apostrophe catastrophe. And I still made catastrophic apostrophe mistakes. But Waterstones, did you know that there was an apostrophe protection society? The battle against grammatical sloppiness. Waterstones have supposedly, Harrison, been forgiven.
Yeah. I mean, I do struggle to muster the effort to care too much about whether Waterstones have got an apostrophe. But I think when you've got a proper noun, a name, a brand in this case, I think dropping the apostrophe is perfectly fine after a long period of time, because everybody does know exactly what you are trying to communicate, whether there are multiple Waterstones or whether it belongs to somebody called Waterstone or something called Waterstone. Yeah,
bothered.
I still know it's a bookshop and I can get books from there.
But do you think there is a little bit of a concern that, grammar use is perhaps not as prioritised as it would have been, let's say, for our parents' generation going through school?
I mean, possibly, but I'm quite relaxed. And by the way, I am very rigorous in at least trying to get apostrophes right, I have to say. But in general, it's one I do let slide, because just so long as I know what somebody's trying to communicate when they write something to me, I'm pretty happy to let it slide. I think sort of leaning too much into grammar fascism that way lines ruin, I think.
Oh, gosh, there we go. Well, any punctuation pedants, please make yourselves known. You can text me 87222, start your message with the word Times. Final thing I want to talk to you about, Harrison. Public proposals. We probably remember there was a video at Newcastle University where a graduate picked up her degree, and as she got it, she was proposed to in the middle of the ceremony. And some people thought, oh, that's nice and romantic. Others have thought, oh my goodness, how inappropriate to have shared that moment on such a public stage. It could all have gone wrong. Turns out, there's now a whole industry that help people plan proposals. Do you ever think it should be done in public?
No, this is one of those stories you read, well, from my perspective anyway, and you just go, I can think of almost nothing worse than this. I sort of feel sorry for everybody involved, really. Even for the fellow who thought that was a good idea, who's now getting quite a lot of flack. I suspect the motivations were very sort of pure and innocent, but mostly for the person receiving that proposal. That moment, I think, unlike grammar, I take quite a traditional view on this. I think it's a very sacred moment between two people, one of the most important moments of your life. And it's a time where there's a lot of pressure on both people just to begin with anyway. And I think you should be able to accept or even reject a proposal and be able to properly think it through without having thousands of people watching you do it. I can think of very few things worse than being proposed to in such a public way.
I think we're in the same camp here. Harrison, thank you so much for going through the papers with me this morning. Harrison Griffiths, political commentator at Young Voices. Harrison, thank you.